So, a very good evening to all our viewers today. We have with us a seasoned professional from the space of CSR, sustainability, and human rights. It is because of him that we have today the global minimum standard for responsible business conduct, which is defined by the UNGP and human rights in 2011. It's because of his work. He has been a pioneer in developing standards for human rights internationally on defines the ground rules for all the countries presently working in the space of corporate responsibility and human rights. He has also held many academic positions and presently is a professor at Copenhagen Law Faculty as a Copenhagen Law Faculty visiting professor at Columbia University, New York, Soros Law Faculty, Riga, Monash University, Melbourne, in China. And it is a great pleasure and an honor to invite you and have with you today Sune Skadegaard, founder and CEO, Global CSR. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for the introduction and great to see you again. And I think it's an amazing initiative that you are creating and have created in India. So I'm very pleased with having this dialogue again. And time has moved the direction, the arrow towards the work we've been doing in through so many years. Although I have to put a disclaimer in that I cannot take credit for the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Late Professor John Ruggie should have that credit completely on his own, although of course I worked closely with him during his mandate from 2005 until 2011. But he was a true genius in making sure that all stakeholders came together, governments, businesses, civil society, and finally managed to get the agreement through with the UN Human Rights Commission that unanimously endorsed the UN guiding principles on business and human rights from 2011. So credit to late Professor Ruggie, and he should have received the Nobel Prize for that, but he never managed to get it.
Well, you have been working with him for so long, and you know the intricacies of it. So, as of the time that you started working on it, and today, what are the developments that you have seen in your tenure of working in the space of human rights? You have been an active advocate for it, entrepreneur, and an influencer. So, what are the key changes that you would like to mention over here?
You can see that, I mean, I used to be an attorney at law, doing international law, ending up in Russia doing big telecom companies or establishing those. When in the mid-90s, the term corporate social responsibility appeared primarily in the UK. And it was centered around what we call the stakeholder-based approach to corporate social responsibility. Ask your stakeholders what they want from you and do what they want. So I was utterly dumbfounded that there was no reference under the discourse of corporate social responsibility to human rights at that point of time in the mid-90s. So if we think about corporate social responsibility, it's about how we deal with sustainability, environmental sustainability, of course, economic sustainability, anti-corruption, anti-competition, but also how we deal with human beings. And I would put that first, social sustainability. So I changed my career path completely and ventured into working with businesses on human rights as the core of social sustainability, or the S in the ESG or the core of corporate social responsibility. And of course, that was an uphill battle, even though it was logical, obvious. I mean, human rights, as agreed amongst all nations in the world, define the bare minimum for human dignity for each and every human being in the world. And we all agree on that politically. The big challenge, how does this affect companies? We know what states should do, and we keep states to account for their human rights record, but we didn't know how businesses that has a huge impact in the real life, and with the growing market economies, we didn't have those definitions. So that became, so say, my professional life since 1996. I started up with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, creating their project, and then became a board member, and since then the chair of the board. And that institution still an important institution in the realm of business and human rights. And then I also started my own firm from 1998, Global CSR, thinking that we needed to get some businesses demonstrating to other businesses how you do this in practice. And I was lucky to work with a few very large corporations like Shell International, but not least the big pharmaceutical company Novo Nordisk, which is a Danish company, and they decided to take me in-house for 2 years to define their strategies from 1999 to 2001, which incidentally was the same time as we had the UN Global Compact come around. So the UN at that time, or Kofi Annan, also with the help at that time from Professor John Ruggie, designed the UN Global Compact, moving from a stakeholder-based approach to corporate social responsibility to the principles-based approach. Companies should take into account international principles for social, environmental, and economic sustainability. It's represented by the 10 principles in the Global Compact. They should move that into their strategy thinking and their daily operations. So that was, so to say, half the way. Now we had the UN move out into the world and tell businesses you should align with the international principles for sustainable development, and not least human rights, which cover the first 6 principles. The core labor rights are also human rights. The big deficit with the UN Global Compact is that it's voluntary in nature. So it was only the companies that had the goodwill and the management surplus that started working with the principles or did relevant work in relation to aligning strategies and actions. And there were no prescriptions on how to do that. And the UN was well aware of that. Professor John Ruggie was well aware of that. So in 2005, he was then appointed by the UN to finally, so to say, solve the Gordian knot of what does it mean for businesses to respect human rights. And as you rightfully mentioned in the introduction, I worked very closely with John Ruggie. I was an expert advisor to the Business Leaders Initiative on Human Rights, and he consulted that group of companies regularly, and he used the examples that we made with at that point Statoil, now Equinix, but also Novo Nordisk and other large corporations that would have experience in implementing a management system in relation to human rights. And he then spent 6 years developing the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, taking in that learning, defining for all companies in the world, no matter what size they are or what they do, what does it mean for you to respect human rights? as the bare minimum that we can expect from any business in the world that claim to be responsible. And he defined it by a policy commitment. That's easy to make for any company to commit to respect human rights. And there are some elements that need to be fulfilled in order to align with the minimum standard. The next point is human rights due diligence. Oh, all companies that claim to be responsible companies need to do due diligence. And not due diligence in the sense of assessing a company before we buy it in mergers and acquisitions, but human rights due diligence, defined separately from the normal discourse of financial due diligence or in due diligence in mergers and acquisitions. So he defined what is the minimum required for any business to manage its impacts on human dignity, on human rights. And it's well defined in the Guiding Principles, Chapter 2. So there's a prescription for any company to go in, read the requirements, and get started doing their due diligence. So that was the second requirement, policy commitment, due diligence. And then the third requirement from the standard, the globally agreed minimum standard for responsible business conduct, the third requirement was access to remedy. People experience impacts from businesses. There's no company in the world that will not adversely impact the human rights of its employees and of other stakeholders. If I overwork one of my employees, that's an impact on their human rights, their right to rest and leisure. If they have an accident in the workplace, that's an adverse impact on their right to safe and healthy working conditions, and so forth. So now the call is, or was from 2011, still is, for all companies to manage their potential adverse impacts on human rights, their risks of impacts on human beings. And every company should do that in their own operations. And on top of that, they're responsible for impacts that occurs with their business relationships. So they have to require from their business relationships also to do their due diligence. They should not do it for them, but they have, as a business, if I want to claim that I'm a responsible company, I need to require from my suppliers and my customers, you also have to meet the minimum standard for responsible business conduct and do your due diligence where you become transparent about how you manage your risks of impacts. So the management system is simple. And of course, in 2011, when the standard was unanimously endorsed by the UN, our arms that were half up with the UN Global Compact came all the way up, because finally the vision we had with our work from 1996 came true. Now we had a UN instrument and we needed a global instrument so that covers all companies internationally. We had a global instrument that clearly described what we expect from businesses. The challenge has been that few companies would read the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as a must, because still it was merely a UN instrument, and there was nobody looking after whether they met the standard or not, only the more advanced companies that implemented the management system. So it would, for many practitioners in the field, like yourselves and others, it would be seen as a nice to have rather than a need to have. And we know what happens to nice to haves. They are being taken apart, and parts are being used, other parts are not being used, and so forth. So of course, the work from our side since then has been to create companies that one-to-one implement the management system so that they can show it to others and become the best practice example, not only for other businesses, but also for governments, so that governments can see, okay, this is how a genuine human rights due diligence practice would look like. What then happened politically in the meantime in the EU, and we're also happy to have been part of that development since in 2013 we wrote a guide for small medium-sized enterprises in the EU Commission. For the EU Commission, it has been translated into 27 languages on what respecting human rights means for a small medium-sized enterprise. What we can expect from any company. We have to expect due diligence from any company, but of course the requirement from the standard is that you don't need to have the same complexity in your systems or the same documentation for your systems if you are a smaller company. So we wrote a guide around that, and the knowledge that was built within the EU Commission has now made it possible that we now have regulation coming out from the EU since 2022 on requiring businesses in the EU to respect human rights as defined by the UN guiding principles. And of course, for us, that's a great achievement, because we all know that then it can become mainstream, and then we can see the scaling up of respect for human rights. And not only in the EU, because part of the responsibility is to require from your business relationships that they do due diligence. So we'll see the good practices that will be established over the coming years with EU-based companies or companies operating in the EU spread to all parts of the world. And the reference is global, so there's no, so it's fine. It's better than inventing your own requirements for your suppliers and then trying to pushing them using the globally agreed minimum standard that was presented to the UN as principled pragmatism. It's pragmatic. You can do it.
That's a very pioneering work, and everyone in the world looks up to EU when it comes to sustainability, human rights, and CSR, and even when it comes to environment-related initiatives that EU has introduced to taxonomy. But when you look at the global perspective, what changes have you seen that the other governments or the other corporates, which are not necessarily headquartered in EU, but even in other countries, how have they evolved in it? What changes, or maybe one or two changes that you could say? Because it's great to have it in the parent company, but when it comes to trickling down and making it available in countries which are emerging, just the basic knowledge of what is the person's human right is a question, So how have the parent companies ensured that these basic things have been ensured?
And it depends a lot, of course, whether you look at a European company with subsidiaries all over the world. But of course, that's one way that it will be moving as we see it now. But even if you look at the Corporate Companies Act in India, the change that came around in, I think it was 2013 or 14, also, apart from the 2% payment to community engagement, which is like a tax, I would propose, there was actually also a change to the management system of companies that was inspired by the UN guiding principles on business and human rights from 2011. So it's already resting with a lot of large Indian companies being aware that in order to do business in today's business environment internationally, we need to do the minimum that all countries agreed to, including the Indian government. And we are seeing that in China as well. We are seeing that all over the world, that policies are being shaped and regulation is being shaped. And when regulators look at how do we regulate business, then they look to their international obligations. And the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that was endorsed by all countries in the world have put an obligation on states to regulate businesses within their territory to do due diligence. So instead of inventing their own requirements or demands, there would be a strong political sense for fulfilling the international human rights obligations or duties of the state, and then start using that framework. It's also a much bigger favor to the companies operating in all countries, that they seek to align with what we can agree on internationally. So we don't come up with new arbitrary requirements, but try to stick to the bare minimum that Professor John Ruggie, in his brilliant work, foresaw could actually make changes on the ground. We have yet to see whether that will realize. But I mean, Danish workers in a factory have the same wants and needs as Indian workers in a factory in India. They have the same human rights. Human rights are defined by the UN, so we have the same common understanding of human rights. And we now need to calibrate our businesses towards those key elements of human dignity. And we all need to do it so it won't impede competition.
I totally agree with you on this. And I'm sure even others would reckon to the same. Now it has been 3 years that we met last on live interaction with global change makers. There have been a lot of development at global CSR. You're also working on a tech tool, you see, at the last we spoke. So would you like to share a little bit more on the developments on that front? And there are 30 companies which are already using it. So what is it about and how it could be scaled up?
Yeah, so in 2021 we finalized the beta version, and you know, we're continuously improving that, but we didn't start promote it widely yet. We wanted to make sure that it works well and that all the needs of our present customers are met, and fine-tuning the cloud. And we are now seeking investment to then go on a larger scale, in particularly now that it has become a legal requirement. And there will be a huge market for what we do. But the idea to develop a cloud-based tool or platform to do your due diligence is twofold. The first one is the practical one. We would develop Excel files that would one-to-one correspond to the requirements from the standard for due diligence. But working in Excel files, doing your due diligence on a regular basis, operational level, possibly in 60 countries, is having many people working together on the assessments proved not very efficient. There's a huge risk of information getting lost in working from that. So we scanned the area. We scanned what was available globally in terms of cloud-based tools or management tools that we could apply for our own work when we onboarded companies to the minimum standard. And we could find not a single platform that was aligned with the guiding principles requirements. We had different platforms for supply chain management, EcoVadis, not aligned with the standard, like CEDEX Meta, not aligned with the standard. There were lots of platforms out there, but they were all invented before 2011, and they weren't changed accordingly. So basically, we couldn't use them. They would ask the companies to divert from the standard, and we wouldn't like that. So instead, we set forth to develop a platform. And of course, as a small consultancy, relatively small consultancy, we didn't have many funds to do that with. And hence, it has taken until today, 3 years to have a really good platform to work from. And of course, our clients have used it since 2021. And now we are seeking an investment to make it even more efficient. So one of the elements is that you can use it to do your due diligence and document that you do your due diligence. You can machine validate all your impact assessments, which is of huge importance now that there's a regulatory overview on what you do. The other part, and that's the more important part, and the reason why we are so well fitted in developing this platform, is that you can have all the information needed, all the guidance needed to do due diligence put into the platform. Small videos explaining what you're doing, chapters explaining how do you understand human rights in a business context, how do you understand the environmental impacts, how do you understand anti-corruption, anti-competition, tax in a business context from a responsibility point of view, so that it has become a platform where you do not need much prior knowledge to go in and use the platform to conduct your due diligence and to deliver to your business relationships, your investors, or now regulators, to demonstrate that you do due diligence.
And we can download this tool on the Play Store.
You cannot you can sign up for a license to the tool, but for educational institutions, you can get a free use of a single unit, or you can get a single unit access, so you can have your students try to make an impact assessment of ICSR.
That would be lovely. And if they want to use it for their company, they need to buy the license. What is the name of the tool?
Right now, the platform is called CSR Cloud, but we are changing the name within a few weeks, actually, from now, to C Impacts.
Okay, so if anyone among our students want to use it for their company, they need to check out C Impacts.
Yeah, right now they have to look at CSR Cloud, and then in a few weeks it will be C Impacts, but it's the same platform. It's just changing the name. Yeah.
That's lovely, and as visionary as you have been always. So in the coming 3 years, what are your thoughts? How would the trends change, and how would human rights gain more prominence in the system, and how will it trickle down to the grassroots?
Human rights due diligence. You know, you have policy commitment on human rights, you do your due diligence. Human rights due diligence is becoming, so to say, the name of the game. If you don't get human rights due diligence, you shouldn't advise companies. If companies do not do human rights due diligence, I establish this management system where they do regular impact assessments in own operations, and they also manage their business relationships, requiring from their business relationships to do human rights due diligence, then they will be out of business. And it will move very fast, because now it has been passed here in May. the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive was passed in the EU, requiring human rights and environmental due diligence, right? So if you don't do that, or the large corporations in the EU will have huge fines. As part of their due diligence, they will have to ask their business relationships also to do due diligence. That's the best way to seek to prevent and mitigate adverse impacts in your value chain. So that will trickle down not only within the EU, but of course across the world. And it's fair. It's not an unfair expectation. It's not a European invention. It's a globally agreed standard. So we all agreed to it. I mean, the Chinese government was very much in favor of the UN guiding principles, and so was the Indian government, and for good reasons. Because what has happened historically with Indian businesses, oh, you would be seen as the businesses that would be high risk for European and American companies. Finally, the UN guiding principles overrules that and say all businesses, no matter where they operate, what they do, what size they are, have risks of adverse impacts. We all need to have a management system in place where we manage our particular risks of adverse impacts, whether we operate out of the EU or whether we operate out of India. So it's a level playing field. It's the same requirement for all businesses. So the historic notion that, I would only set my code of conduct for suppliers to my Indian suppliers, and then I would audit my Indian suppliers because I didn't believe that they could live up to these 8 labor rights. That time is over. All companies need to meet the minimum. It's not difficult. It's not rocket science. It's actually quite easy to relate to human rights. Actually, my experiences from doing due diligence in India or in Philippines or in Vietnam or China is that there's actually a better recognition, understanding, appreciation of human dignity and human rights in emerging economies than we have it in our somewhat old school business societies in the EU and in the US. That would where we would have a kind of neo-colonial approach that, the impacts are only out there, so now we only need to do due diligence out there. Those days are over, and we all have risks of impacts. We have not assessed a single Danish company or a Belgian company or Norwegian company that did not identify risks of adverse impacts on at least 18 to 20 human rights of the 48 human rights. And then they need to be transparent about how they manage those risks. And that will be the same for an Indian company. So it's the same requirement, the same expectation. We will manage the risks differently, depending on what context we operate in, but we have to be transparent about how we manage them. Did that answer your question?
That's very well said. It is the same for all now, and no one can escape something like this. So in order to create more awareness and to equalize things, how do you, what are the knowledge gaps that comes to your mind, and how do you see us also enabling and empowering to reach the goals?
Well, I mean, there are 2 primary knowledge gaps. One is, of course, knowing the standard, the management system. But when we run labs, workshops on this, and when we explain the management system, everybody nods and recognize that it's similar to any ISO management system, so it's well known with businesses to have management system in place that manage risks, right? Now we're looking at risks of impacts on human beings, And so it's a different scope. And that's so the second knowledge gap. I mean, the first is to appreciate that it's something we know already, this management system. And John Ruggie was very particular about that. I need to present something that business know, the management system. But the scope of the management system, human rights, is when on the outset still a black hole, right? So most companies say it's impossible for me to manage 48 human rights, which is the scope of the management system, the international bill of human rights, the globally agreed human rights. So there's only one way to address that, and that is to go through each of the human rights to see whether they are relevant for your business. But mind you, it's only 48 human rights. That will take you 2 hours to read through the human rights, and possibly if you don't understand what they mean, but it's pretty intuitive for most of us what right to fair trial means, what freedom of expression means, what freedom of information means. So if we don't, then we just read what does it mean in a business context. And that's why we wrote this book, Human Rights Explained for Business, but it's also on the cloud, so you can actually access it anytime to see how each of the 48 human rights are relevant for business. But of course, we need to impart that understanding with business people that did not read human rights or were not educated in human rights in their school system. And then we need to ask our school systems to educate our population on human rights so that they understand what their rights are. And we have many governments around the world, including the Danish government, that has an opposition to educating the population on their human rights, because the states also have a duty to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. But if the population do not know what their rights are, then it's easier to manage the population. But that is not so. So basically, it's easy. It's quite intuitive. Go to it. Don't. The first right, the right to development. It's about indigenous people's rights. Okay. Do we have impact on indigenous people's rights in our operations? Possibly if you operate in an area where you have indigenous peoples or you use indigenous people's patents or similar, then you may have a risk of impact. Okay, then you describe how you manage that risk. That's the requirement. You may have impacts, but you have to be transparent about how you manage to prevent or mitigate that risk. Next human right, the right not to be subjected to discrimination. You can assess that. I don't know a company that wouldn't have a risk there, be it on gender discrimination or minority status of all kinds, that you would have to assess where are the risks for that particular operation operating in this context, and how do I seek to prevent and mitigate that discrimination occurs in my company. It's also part of diversity inclusion, but it's a basis for diversity and inclusion work, right? The next human right, the right to work. Everybody should have a contract. Everybody should have fair dismissals. Everybody should have vocational training. That's all part of the right to work. Do we have risks there in that area? Of course we do. Do we educate our employees well enough to conduct their work? That's right to vocational training. It's a risk that we don't. We are doing something. Let's describe what we do and measure whether it's good enough. That's being accountable for. So as you can see, it's pretty easy to go through all the human rights, find out, do you have a risk? And then if you have a risk, you have to go to work and describe what you're doing to prevent and mitigate. And most companies, Indian, Danish, American, doesn't matter, would find that they have activities in place to manage around 80% of the identified risks already, but they have no consolidated understanding on how they manage these risks. And that's what they have to create in order to document their due diligence.
That's very interesting. And maybe we could run a 2-hour capsule on this together.
That would be wonderful. You know, I would love to work together with your good selves and your brilliant organization. And there's so many possibilities
Yeah,
now that it's becoming uh, law and it's becoming a professional requirement to understand this. We should definitely do our work to spread the good word.
definitely. Definitely. We do look forward to, and we'll have a separate chat on this. But yes, it would be lovely to work on this aspect and reach to larger audiences and educate them on human rights and the UNGP. It has been lovely talking to you after 3 years and knowing the progress that you've made and embedded technology in human rights and trying to reach out to larger audiences. It's quite an achievement. You have been always a visionary leader and an aspiration for most of us. And it's lovely to know the work that you are doing. And we wish you all the best and look forward to working with you in time.
Thank you, Harsha, and you're also a beacon for us here. And your audience is approximately 1,000 times bigger than our audience. So keep to the good work, and I really look forward to collaboration going forward. So keep up the good work, and thank you for the nice words.
Thank you. Thank you. You have a lovely day.